Resident Evil has had some bad games, but nothing prepared us for what Capcom did in 2016. They took a beloved franchise, gutted it, charged $30, and killed it less than 3 years later. Today we're ranking every Resident Evil game, starting with the one that made fans wonder if Capcom had lost their minds. Umbrella Corps. Released in June 2016 for PS4 and PC, this was mostly a multiplayer shooter. It had a single-player mode called The Experiment with over 20 basic training missions, but no real campaign. The main focus was 3 versus 3 PvP matches, basically a bare-bones competitive shooter with almost none of the Resident Evil feel. Here's the kicker. It wasn't free to play. It cost $30 for a multiplayer game in a market where that was already risky. The Metacritic score sank to 43 over 100, a clear "don't buy this" signal. Players saw it as a cynical cash grab using the Resident Evil name without actually delivering a Resident Evil game. The game effectively died within 2.5 years. No farewell event, no final update. Umbrella Corps runs on P2P hosting, so Capcom never even had dedicated servers to formally shut down. It just quietly stopped mattering. Everyone who bought it had moved on, and no one new bothered. Umbrella Corps marked Resident Evil hitting rock bottom. Fans genuinely wondered if the series was done, but at least it didn't drag on like Operation Raccoon City, which stuck around to disappoint way longer. Operation Raccoon City is what happens when a major franchise outsources to a studio that has no idea what made the series work in the first place. Resident Evil. Operation Raccoon City, Slant 6 Games, not Capcom, developed this 2012 third-person shooter that dropped on PS3 and Xbox 360 with one job: make Resident Evil multiplayer. And here's the thing, they actually sold over 2 million copies in the first year, which is wild, because Metacritic gave it a 52. That's not a typo, 52. The game takes place during RE2 and RE3, but it's got nothing to do with either story. You're playing as Umbrella operatives, USS soldiers basically, running around Raccoon City with up to 3 friends in co-op. The AI teammates were there if you didn't have friends, which, you know, not ideal. The whole thing was designed around cooperative shooting, not survival horror. No resource scarcity, no tension, just 4 people blasting zombies and each other. Here's where it gets weird. Despite getting absolutely demolished by critics, it found an audience. 2 million people bought this thing. That tells you something about the fan base at the time. They wanted more Resident Evil, even if it was fundamentally broken, even if it didn't understand what made RE work. The community split hard on this one. Some people had genuine fun with the co-op chaos. Others saw it as proof that Capcom was willing to let anyone slap the RE logo on anything and call it a day. But if you think Operation Raccoon City was a departure, wait until you see what Capcom did next. Resident Evil 6 is Capcom's most ambitious disaster. Released October 2012 with 600 staff members and a budget that could have funded 3 smaller games, it sold 5.3 million copies and somehow still disappointed everyone. Resident Evil 6. Here's the thing about RE6. It wasn't bad because it was action focused. It was bad because it tried to be everything simultaneously. 4 separate campaigns, 20 hours of content, regenerating enemies that just wouldn't die, co-op modes, competitive modes, QuickTime events layered on top of QuickTime events. Capcom looked at their fanbase and decided the solution wasn't to pick a direction. It was to go in all of them at once. The game shipped with Leon's campaign being horror-tinged action, Chris's campaign being pure military shooter, Ada's campaign being stealth puzzle hybrid, and Jake's campaign being, honestly, nobody remembers Jake's campaign. Each one felt like a different game bolted onto the same engine, which sounds interesting until you realize it means none of them feel cohesive. It's like ordering a pizza and getting pizza, sushi, tacos, and a steak simultaneously. Sure, there's more food, but you didn't want more food. You wanted one good meal. Metacritic gave it 63 out of 100. That's not a score, that's a shrug. The community response was worse. RE6 became the franchise's turning point, the moment fans collectively agreed Capcom had lost the plot. It wasn't just that it abandoned horror, it's that it abandoned focus entirely. If you think, RE6's identity crisis was bad, wait until you see what Capcom did next with multiplayer spin-offs that lasted shorter than a TikTok trend. Resident Evil Resistance / Reverse. Resident Evil tried multiplayer twice in recent years, and both times it went exactly nowhere. Resistance launched in April 2020 alongside the RE3 remake, which sounds generous until you realize it was asymmetrical 1 versus 4 gameplay where one player controlled a mastermind trying to stop 4 survivors. A Reverse came out in October 2022, bundled with Village, flipping the formula into competitive 4-player matches. Both sounded creative on paper. Both died within months. Here's the thing. Peak concurrent players on PC never broke 5,000. For context, That's lower than most indie games that actually have communities. By 2024, Resistance was delisted entirely and pulled from digital stores. Reverse is still technically available, but sales end in March 2025, and servers shut down in June 2025. They're basically gone. The problem wasn't the ideas. Asymmetrical multiplayer can work. The problem was execution. And more importantly, nobody actually wanted to play them. Resistance had balance issues that made the mastermind either completely overpowered or completely useless depending on the map, as Reverse was a forgettable competitive shooter in a franchise built on single-player horror. Neither had the staying power to build a community, and without a community, multiplayer games are just expensive ghosts. Capcom learned something valuable from this. The franchise's strength isn't in competitive modes or live service experiments. It's in focused, story-driven campaigns. These weren't failures because the concepts were bad. They were failures because they didn't understand what people actually wanted from Resident Evil. But if you think multiplayer spin-offs were rough, wait until we get to the actual mainline games that people forgot about. Starting with a prequel that introduced one of the most frustrating inventory systems ever designed. Resident Evil 0 is the prequel nobody asked for that somehow made survival horror worse by overthinking it. Resident Evil 0, released in November 2002 as a GameCube exclusive. RE0 takes place just hours before the mansion incident, filling in gaps nobody needed filled. Sounds promising, it wasn't. The game introduced a dual character control system that let you swap between two protagonists on the fly, which sounds innovative until you realize it's just inventory management with extra steps. Here's the thing, instead of a traditional item box, you could drop items anywhere on the ground. Sounds flexible. In practice, you're constantly backtracking through hallways picking up stuff you dropped 3 rooms ago because you needed space for a key card. The game forces you to manage 2 inventories simultaneously, and it's tedious in ways the original games never were. The campaign runs about 4 to 5 hours, which is fine for a prequel. The problem is the story doesn't justify existing. You're watching Umbrella's plan unfold in real time, but it's less compelling than just reading about it in RE1. The mystery is gone. You already know how this ends. The dual character system gets praised by some players who genuinely enjoyed the puzzle-solving aspect, but most people found it more annoying than engaging. Critically, RE0 was competent. It wasn't broken. It just felt like Capcom experimenting with mechanics that didn't need experimenting. A 2016 remake brought it to modern platforms, but it didn't fix the fundamental design issues. The game exists in this weird space where it's technically sound, but fundamentally less interesting than the game surrounding it. But if you think RE0's mechanical confusion was bad, wait until you see what happens when the franchise tries to make a sequel that actually works. Resident Evil Revelations 2. Resident Evil Revelations 2 is the underdog story of the franchise's comeback era. Released in February 2015, it dropped on nearly every platform with an episodic structure that stretched across 4 weeks, unfolding a tight campaign lasting around 8 to 10 hours total and featuring 2 pairs of playable characters, Claire and Moira, plus Barry and Natalia. Now, this wasn't one of Capcom's big-budget extravaganzas. Far from it. Revelations 2 was made on a modest budget, yet it quickly gained a cult following, selling 2.6 million copies by March 2020 and becoming a fan favorite for good reason. The focus wasn't on bombastic set pieces or over-the-top action. It was on solid, suspenseful survival horror and character dynamics that felt personal. One of the biggest wins? The introduction of a robust raid mode with over 50 missions that offered some of the franchise's best cooperative gameplay outside the main story. Players could dive back in endlessly, sharpening combat skills and unlocking gear, which added a ton of replay value without flashy spectacle. Here's the kicker. Revelations 2 is widely credited with saving Resident Evil's focus on character-driven horror just before Resident Evil 7 flipped the series into a new direction. It proved that Capcom could still deliver genuinely tense, emotionally engaging stories without throwing mountains of money at it. The game's episodic format also allowed for tighter pacing, and its cliffhangers kept fans hooked week to week. It lacks the polish of AAA blockbusters, but makes up for it with atmosphere, suspense, and a story that actually matters to the characters we care about. So, Revelations 2 sits in this weird spot. Low budget, but high impact. A cult favorite that quietly brought Resident Evil back from the brink. And if you think that's an interesting twist, wait until we jump into the 2020 remake of Resident Evil 3, where things get a whole lot more controversial. Resident Evil 3 2020 remake dropped in April 2020, riding the massive momentum of RE2 Remake's success. Capcom had just proven they could take a classic and rebuild it for modern audiences, so everyone expected the same treatment for RE3 Remake. Turns out, no. Resident Evil 3 2020 remake. Here's the thing about the 2020 remake. It's not bad, it's just aggressively shorter. The original 1999 game offered a sprawling interconnected map where you'd backtrack through Raccoon City, solving puzzles and managing resources across multiple zones. The remake? 5 to 6 hours, linear sequences, then it's over. That's roughly 40% less content. And yeah, people noticed. The main draw is Nemesis. This monster hunts you relentlessly throughout the campaign, and the AI actually feels threatening. Unlike Mr. X in RE2 Remake, who was basically a scripted encounter you could learn to manipulate, Nemesis adapts. It's aggressive, unpredictable, parts and keeps you moving. That part works. The problem is, everything else got pared down to make room for it. Capcom scrapped the interconnected map entirely. Gone is exploring a living city with multiple routes and shortcuts. You're funneled through linear corridors with occasional branching paths looping back. Puzzle solving got gutted, and resource management became trivial, since the game's short length means you're never truly desperate for ammo or healing. Then there's Resistance, the multiplayer mode bundled with the remake. One player controls a mastermind setting traps and spawning enemies, while 4 survivors try to escape. It's not terrible, but it feels like filler. Something Capcom threw in to justify the $60 price tag when the single-player campaign can't carry it alone. The community split hard. Some liked the tighter pacing and Nemesis' constant threat. Others branded it a cash grab, a stripped-down classic writing RE2 Remake's goodwill without matching effort. Sales hit 2.8 million copies, but the debate never died down. If you think RE3 Remake's cuts were controversial, wait till you hear about Revelations. Resident Evil? Revelations. Resident Evil. Revelations is set on an abandoned luxury cruise ship called the Queen Zenobia, and you're exploring it with Jill Valentine trying to figure out what happened to the crew. The whole thing is structured episodically, which sounds gimmicky, but it actually works. Each episode ends on a cliffhanger, and you're constantly discovering new areas of the ship, solving puzzles, and piecing together the mystery. It's 8 to 10 hours of pure exploration and atmosphere, which is exactly what early Resident Evil games did best. Here's the thing. Revelations nailed the survival horror formula when the franchise was drowning in action. RE5 had already happened, and the series was bloated, overstuffed, and had completely lost the plot. Then this handheld game showed up and reminded everyone what made Resident Evil actually scary. Tight corridors, limited ammo, environmental puzzles, and genuine tension. The ship itself becomes a character. You're constantly backtracking, unlocking new areas, and the atmosphere is genuinely unsettling. The raid mode added over 100 separate stages across multiple areas and difficulties, which gave the game serious replay value. You could grind through these missions, unlock new weapons, and keep playing long after the campaign ended. For a handheld game, that's substantial content. When Revelations got ported to PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, it didn't just survive the transition, it thrived. Players who never touched a 3DS suddenly discovered this underrated gem, and the community response was immediate. Fans loved it, critics loved it, but somehow it still doesn't get mentioned in best of conversations nearly as much as it deserves. The reason Revelations matters is simple. It proved that you don't need cutting-edge hardware or massive budgets to make a great Resident Evil game. You need good design, atmosphere, and respect for what made the series work in the first place. It's the kind of game that gets overlooked because it came out on the wrong platform at the wrong time, but anyone who actually played it knows better, which makes RE5 look even worse by comparison, and because that game had every advantage and still managed to disappoint. Resident Evil 5 is the second best-selling mainline game in the franchise, yet it's also one of the most contentious. Released in 2009 for PS3 and Xbox 360, it sold 7.8 million copies and was built around co-op from the ground up. But here's where it gets complicated. Resident Evil 5. The game pairs Chris Redfield with Sheva Alomar, a local operative, and drops them into West Africa to stop a bioterrorism plot. 8 to 10 hours of solid action gameplay, tight gunplay, and the kind of spectacle Capcom had been building toward since RE4. On paper, it's a quality entry. The co-op works, the campaign is engaging, and mechanically it delivers exactly what RE5 promises. But the setting and enemy design sparked a conversation that hasn't stopped. You're fighting predominantly black enemies in an African setting, and the game doesn't exactly handle the optics with care. Infected villagers, tribal aesthetics, the whole package reads differently depending on who's playing. Some players see a game that was simply set in a location and populated it accordingly. Others see design choices that feel uncomfortable, even if unintentional. Here's the thing, both perspectives have merit. RE5 is genuinely a well-made action game. The mechanics are solid, the co-op is fun, and if you strip away the cultural context, it's mechanically sound. But context matters. The game exists in a real world where those design choices carry weight, and dismissing criticism as oversensitivity misses the legitimate point that representation in games does matter. The franchise has moved on, but RE5 remains a fascinating case study in how a commercially successful, mechanically competent game can still spark legitimate debate about its portrayal. It's not a bad game, it's just a complicated one. And speaking of complicated, Village takes everything RE5 did with co-op and atmosphere and pushes it in an entirely different direction. Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil Village had one of the toughest acts to follow. Coming off the franchise reviving RE7, it had to prove survival horror could still pack a punch in 2021's next-gen environment, and it mostly delivered. Clocking in around 10 to 12 hours, Village continues Ethan Winters' story, keeping the gritty first-person perspective that reinvented the series. But here's the thing. Even with next-gen releases on PS5 and Xbox Series X, the majority of its 5.4 million first-year sales came from PS4 and Xbox One. The player base had barely moved on, and Capcom wisely made sure to cater to both old-gen and new-gen hardware. Of course, Village isn't just known for gameplay. Lady Dimitrescu burst onto the scene so hard that she didn't just become a horror icon, but a downright meme sensation, dominating gaming culture far beyond the usual Resident Evil crowd. Big, imposing, and totally captivating, she single-handedly helped the game cross into mainstream hype in a way few RE characters ever have. Critically, Village scored a solid 84 on Metacritic, praised especially for its atmospheric environments and the way it blends gothic horror aesthetics with modern graphical power. That said, not everyone was wild about the story. Many players found it too convoluted, bouncing between horror, action set pieces, and weird lore dumps, which diluted the tension RE7 had so carefully built. Some argued the horror took a back seat to expanded action gameplay, making it feel more like an action horror hybrid than pure survival terror. Still, the effort to balance next-gen tech with mass appeal and ongoing storytelling ambition was clear. Resident Evil Village didn't just push graphical fidelity, it navigated meme culture, fan expectations, and a fractured player base all at once. It wasn't perfect, but it captured attention and kept the franchise relevant in a crowded market. If you think continuing Ethan Winters' saga in Village was an evolution, wait till you see where it all really began. Resident Evil 7, Biohazard. Resident Evil 7, Biohazard. Resident Evil 7 completely flipped the script on the entire franchise. After the bloated, over-the-top action disasters of Resident Evil 5 and 6, Capcom went all in on survival horror like it was 1996 again. And I can prove it with a tightly focused 9 to 11 hour campaign released in January 2017 that became an unexpected massive commercial success, selling over 13 million copies worldwide and earning a solid 86 on Metacritic. This wasn't just a slight course correction, it was a total reinvention that shocked fans and critics alike. The most obvious and game-changing difference was perspective. Resident Evil 7 ditched the classic third-person camera for a first-person view, throwing players headfirst into the grime, darkness, and constant dread of the Baker family estate. This immersion cranked the horror dial to 11. Every creak, scrape, and shadow felt intensely personal and claustrophobic. You didn't just watch horror happen, you experienced it from a terrifyingly close angle. It was like the difference between reading a scary story and living it, but that first-person shift was only the start. The game's pacing also slowed down drastically compared to its predecessors. Instead of mindless action every 5 minutes, RE7 made you actually explore environments, manage scarce ammo and health supplies, and really fear what might be lurking just around the corner. This return to classic survival horror mechanics brought back the tension and careful pacing that had long been missing. The complexity, atmosphere, and world building restored faith in the franchise, exactly when that faith was at its lowest point. DLC episodes like Not a Hero and End of Zoe added substantial hours of story content, expanding the tangled web of secrets behind the viral outbreak. These extras weren't just side quests. They deepened the narrative and hooked you long after finishing the main campaign. It's widely agreed RE7 saved Resident Evil from the brink of permanent decline. After RE6, most thought the series was dead in the water. RE7 showed Capcom wasn't just listening to fans. They were learning, evolving, and committed to rebuilding their flagship horror legacy. Sure, some longtime fans missed the explosive bombast of past entries, but the critical acclaim for RE7 was near universal. It stands as a landmark entry that redefined what a Resident Evil game could be, proving survival horror still had frightening bite left in 2017 and beyond. In this way, it paved the way for everything that followed, including the ambitious RE Village. But if you think that radical first-person overhaul was bold, wait until you hear about the Wild Leap Resident Evil. Code Veronica took nearly a decade earlier. Resident Evil, Code Veronica. Resident Evil. Code Veronica is like the forgotten middle child of the franchise, not as hyped as RE4, but absolutely crucial in the series' evolution. Released in 2000 exclusively for the Sega Dreamcast, it was the last mainline Resident Evil to grace that dying platform before eventually porting to PlayStation 2, GameCube, and later systems. For about a year and a half, this was the Dreamcast's crown jewel, a defining title trying to keep the console relevant in the face of looming obsolescence. The game features an 8 to 10 hour campaign starring both Claire and Chris Redfield, who you might remember as staples of the franchise by that point. Those dual perspectives allowed Code Veronica to expand on the Resident Evil story beyond what RE2 and RE3 had done, plunging deeper into Umbrella's secrets and the Redfield family drama. But here's the kicker. Fans have long debated whether Code Veronica is actually the true sequel to RE2 or if that title belongs to RE3. Officially, it came after RE3's release, but its narrative ambitions arguably make it feel more like the direct continuation. Code Veronica occupies a strange space in the timeline and in player memory. It keeps the classic survival horror feel alive with fixed camera angles and puzzle solving, but hints at the bigger changes coming with RE4's overhaul of gameplay and storytelling. It's the bridge between old and new, mixing familiar scares with more cinematic storytelling and slightly revamped mechanics. Despite none of those things, Code Veronica is often overshadowed by the revolutionary impact of RE4. RE4 practically reinvented the franchise overnight, and so this game gets labeled underrated or hidden gem among hardcore fans who prize its deepening plot and solid atmosphere. But play it and you'll find it holds up pretty well, with tense moments, memorable villains, and some genuinely creepy set pieces. The Dreamcast exclusivity meant it never quite reached the huge audience it deserved at launch, but the later ports cemented its place in Resident Evil history. It's that transitional classic that hardcore fans swear by, even if casual players jump straight from RE3 to RE4. But if you think that's a niche title, wait until you see what the original Resident Evil brought to the table and how it started this whole survival horror obsession. Resident Evil. Resident Evil's original release in March 1996 wasn't just another game on the PlayStation. It was the birth of survival horror as we know it. Clocking in at around 5 to 7 hours, this compact campaign laid down the blueprint for an entire genre, introducing gameplay and storytelling elements that remain iconic decades later. Everything that came after owes something to what Capcom built here. Before you roll your eyes at tank controls and fixed camera angles, hear me out. These dated mechanics actually define the feel of the game. The clunky movement and restrictive viewpoints weren't just technical limits, they forced tension and cautious play, making every corner and enemy encounter a nail-biter. Players were put right in the oppressive shoes of Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield, with environments dripping in atmosphere and dread. You couldn't just sprint through hallways, you had to think, plan, and move deliberately. Resident Evil sold about 5 million copies over its lifetime, snagging an impressive 89 out of 100 on Metacritic. That score isn't just nostalgia's doing. Critics and fans alike recognize it as a masterpiece. The game introduced key franchise staples, item management that could make or break your run, creative puzzle solving, and the unforgettable sense that you were barely surviving in a nightmare world. The narrative tropes it established, the shadowy Umbrella Corporation, biological horrors, and isolated mansions, became the spine of the series. Every survival horror game that followed borrowed from this playbook. Here's where it gets weird. What started as a technical workaround, like tank controls originally meant to cope with clunky 3D engines, ended up becoming a genre hallmark. Some argue that these controls are part of why the game still scares us, because they limit player agency just enough to keep vulnerability front and center. It's a design born from necessity, but elevated by intention. The developers didn't set out to create psychological tension through mechanical restriction, but that's exactly what happened. Capcom didn't just make a game. They crafted an experience that has stood the test of time. Because while modern entries have smoothed out the rough edges and modernized the controls, none have captured that original blend of survival tension, environmental storytelling, and chilling mood quite like Resident Evil did in 1996. It's both the franchise's foundation and its crown jewel, universally recognized as a classic masterpiece that defined what horror games could be. But if you think the original's legacy is impressive, wait until we dive into Resident Evil 2, which took everything this game started and turned it into something absolutely legendary. Resident Evil 2? Resident Evil 2 is the masterpiece that proved the franchise could expand without losing its soul. Released in January 1998 on PlayStation, it landed on basically every platform that existed after that, from Dreamcast to GameCube to N64. The campaign runs 5 to 8 hours, depending on how thorough you are. But here's where it gets clever. The A/B scenario system means you're not just replaying the same game twice. Leon and Claire's campaigns are genuinely different, with different puzzles, different enemy placements, different story beats. You're looking at roughly 10 to 12 hours of distinct content if you actually commit to both playthroughs. That's not padding, that's design. The numbers back this up. Metacritic 89 out of 100. 5 million copies sold. Those aren't just good numbers, they're the numbers that defined what a survival horror game could be before RE4 came along and redefined the entire industry. But the real achievement isn't the sales or the critical score, it's that RE2 introduced Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield, and they immediately became iconic. Not because of cutscenes or character development, but because you spent 5 to 8 hours with them in the most atmospheric, claustrophobic version of Raccoon City the series has ever created. The atmosphere is suffocating. The map design forces you into tight corridors and interconnected rooms where you're constantly aware of what's behind you and what's ahead. Ammo is scarce enough that you're making real decisions about whether to fight or run. Puzzles actually require you to think instead of just following waypoints. The game respects your intelligence and your time. It doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't explain everything. It just drops you into a nightmare and trusts you to figure it out. Here's the thing. RE2 is almost universally beloved. Fans still replay it 25 years later. The only real criticism you'll hear is nostalgia-driven complaints about tank controls, and even that's more of a yeah. They're dated acknowledgement than actual hatred. Nobody seriously argues RE2 is bad. The conversation isn't whether it's good. The conversation is whether it's the best pre-RE4 game or whether it's the best game in the entire franchise. That's the level of reverence we're talking about here. It set the standard for replayability that the series has chased ever since. The A/B scenario system meant you weren't just grinding through the same content twice, you were experiencing a genuinely different game, different routes, different encounters, different story implications. That's not a gimmick. That's respect for the player's time. But if you think, oh, RE2 is the peak of what Capcom could do with this formula, says wait until you see what they did when they rebuilt it from scratch 21 years later. Resident Evil 2, 2019 remake. Resident Evil 2 didn't just get a remake, it got a resurrection. When Capcom announced they were rebuilding RE2 from the ground up in 2018, nobody knew if they could pull it off. The original was perfect, untouchable. Remaking perfection is how you destroy a legacy. But then January 2019 happened, and suddenly everyone had to eat their words. They took the 1998 masterpiece and rebuilt it entirely using the Ahashar-E engine. New camera, new controls, new everything. Gone were the tank controls and fixed camera angles that defined the original. In their place, an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective that felt modern without feeling wrong. The game still felt like RE2. It just felt like RE2 in 2019. The campaign ran 7 to 10 hours depending on how you played it. They kept the dual scenario system intact, meaning Leon and Claire's playthroughs were genuinely different experiences. Different puzzles, different encounters, different story beats. You weren't just replaying the same game twice with a different character model. You were playing two distinct campaigns that happened to share the same location. Here's where it gets wild. The remake hit 91 on Metacritic. That's not a typo. That's higher than the original's 89. 3 million copies sold in the first year alone. It didn't just succeed, it proved that you could modernize a classic without gutting what made it special. The praise was almost universal. Critics loved it, fans loved it. Even the hardcore purists who swore the original was untouchable had to admit the remake was exceptional. Mr. X, the relentless pursuer stalking you through the police station, became even more terrifying with modern graphics and that over-the-shoulder perspective. You could actually see him coming. That somehow made it worse. The only real debate that emerged was which version was better. And that's not really a debate. That's just people having different preferences. Some players prefer the original's puzzle design and atmosphere, others prefer the remake's presentation and controls. Both arguments hold water. Both versions are phenomenal. The fact that fans can't decisively pick a winner isn't a flaw. It's proof that Capcom nailed the balance between respect and reinvention. This is what a remake should be, not a cash grab. Not a cynical repackaging, a genuine translation of a masterpiece into a new era while keeping its soul intact. RE2 Remake didn't just update a classic, it proved the classic was timeless enough to survive the update. But if you think one remake was impressive, wait until you see what Capcom did with RE4, Resident Evil 4, 2005/2023 remake. There's no way to talk about this game without sounding like you're exaggerating. A 96 on Metacritic, 7.8 million copies sold, a 12 to 15 hour campaign that somehow never dips in quality from the opening village siege to the final boss. Resident Evil 4 didn't just save the franchise, it rewrote the rules for every third-person shooter that came after it. Before RE4, aiming in a third-person game meant locking onto enemies and hoping for the best. Capcom looked at that system, threw it in the garbage, and invented the over-the-shoulder camera. You know, the thing that literally every action game has used for the last 2 decades. Gears of War? Think RE4. The Last of Us? Think RE4. Dead Space? You get the idea. One design decision in 2005 became the foundation of an entire genre, and nobody's improved on the core concept since. But here's the thing that makes RE4 special, beyond its mechanical innovation. The pacing is immaculate. You start in a village fighting farmers with pitchforks. By the midpoint, you're dodging laser grids in a castle. By the end, you're on a military island, fighting regenerating monstrosities that can only be killed by shooting parasites inside their bodies with an infrared scope. Every chapter escalates. Every new area introduces mechanics you haven't seen before. There's zero filler in a 15-hour game, which is basically a miracle of game design. Leon Kennedy went from a rookie cop in Raccoon City to the most absurdly competent special agent in gaming history, suplexing cultists and delivering one-liners like he's getting paid per quip. The Merchant alone became one of the most iconic NPCs ever created. What are you buying? Lives rent-free in the heads of millions of people who played this game as teenagers, which is, you know, not a bad legacy for a guy who just stands in corners selling guns. Then in 2023, Capcom did something borderline insane. They remade it. They looked at a game with a 96 Metacritic score and said, yeah, we can do that again. And honestly, they mostly pulled it off. The remake launched on PS5, Xbox Series X, and PC to a 93 on Metacritic, and moved 1.3 million copies in its first month alone. It's a gorgeous, and mechanically tight reimagining that modernizes the combat and expands the narrative. But here's where it gets complicated. The remake is excellent by every objective measure. Gorgeous visuals, refined controls, expanded story beats, and yet some fans still prefer the original. Not because the remake is worse, but because the 2005 version had this specific elegance to it, a simplicity in its design that felt almost effortless. The remake adds complexity where the original had clarity, and depending on who you ask, that's either an upgrade or a side grade. Both versions are masterpieces. That's not hyperbole. That's just the reality of a game so influential that 18 years after release, the industry is still building on its foundation. RE4 is the ceiling. It's the game every entry in this franchise gets measured against, and the game most third-person shooters get measured against whether they know it or not. And with the franchise sitting at its absolute peak, there's only one thing left to talk about. What comes next? Resident Evil Requiem. And then there's the one we can't actually rank yet. Resident Evil Requiem Requiem is scheduled for 2026 across PS5, Xbox Series X/S, and PC, and Capcom is calling it the grand finale to the modern RE narrative arc, the one that started with RE7's Louisiana Nightmare and continued through Village's Gothic Insanity. This is supposed to be the ending. Here's what we know. Ethan Winters is back, which raises some immediate questions if you finished Village. Returning characters from across the franchise are confirmed, and beyond that, Capcom has told us almost nothing, on purpose. That's basically the entire fact sheet. It's coming, Ethan's involved, other people are involved, please look forward to it, which is, not a lot to work with. But the silence is kind of the point. Capcom knows exactly what they're sitting on. RE7 revitalized the entire franchise from the brink of irrelevance. Village turned a tall vampire lady into the most memed character in gaming history and sold over 5 million copies in its first year. The modern trilogy has earned a level of goodwill that Capcom hasn't had since the original RE4 era, and now they have to stick the landing. The pressure here is genuinely enormous. Ending a trilogy is one of the hardest things any storytelling medium can attempt. For every Return of the King, there are 15 Game of Thrones, Season 8s. Fans have spent years building theories about the Megamycete, about BSAA's corruption, about what Ethan actually is now, about whether Chris Redfield is finally going to get a storyline that doesn't end with him punching a boulder. The expectations aren't just high, they're unreasonable, and Capcom has to meet them anyway. The speculation is running wild. Some fans think Requiem will tie all the way back to the original Umbrella Corporation storyline. Others think it's going to go full cosmic horror with the Megamycete's origins. A few people are convinced every protagonist from every game is showing up for one massive final act. Nobody actually knows. That's the beauty and the terror of it. What I can tell you is this. If Capcom delivers even half of what the community is hoping for, Requiem could be the definitive Resident Evil experience. The culmination of nearly 30 years of survival horror, bioweapons, questionable corporate decisions, and characters who refuse to stay dead, and if they don't deliver, well, at least we'll always have RE4. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.